Hey everybody, thanks for joining me. We'll be going live in about 2 minutes. So yeah, thanks for uh, coming here today. I just a note, I did insert some of the links for some of the one of the papers that I wanted to discuss, sort of what I'm reading, and also from the recent blog that I did. There's two parts. So just a reminder that I use this platform called Medium.com, and it used to be free for everybody. They could access it easily, but then they changed it a few years back so that you could only be you had to be a subscriber in order to do it. So what I did was I added the friend link in the YouTube post. So if you go on to my channel, you can look under the community and you can find the posts there, which are the friend links, which means that you can certainly go on for free and access it for free. So hopefully that helps. So thanks for joining us here today. So we'll start discussing about that. And if you have questions, of course, I'll try and get to them as much as I can. But you know, there's not always enough time. So do look at some of the old videos that I have, and we'll do that. So the first thing I wanted to discuss is the sort of most recent video that we did, which was sort of part 4 of a 6-part series on reversal of type 2 diabetes. And this is sort of what I've been trying to focus on recently. And it's one of these things that has a great impact on your health if you have insulin resistance, prediabetes, or diabetes. It actually impacts your health more than almost anything else. So if you look at things such as heart disease and cancer, the big two things that people die of these days, those are the biggest contributors to it, much more than things like cholesterol. The only thing that might be close is smoking. So, of course, smoking has definitely come down in recent years, but unfortunately, type 2 diabetes has gone up. The good news is that it can be reversed, and the most recent video was part 4, I think, of a 6-part series, and this is taken from a class that I do in Toronto. It's a clinic for type 2 diabetes remission. So the goal is to put type 2 diabetes into remission. And it's really available to the public, but it's really only for those people in Toronto. So if you're interested, it's at the Boniface. It's called Boniface Park is the clinic that I do it at. And, I wanted to make the videos accessible to everybody. So those videos are all there. So part 4, and then there's a 6-part series. But of course, you can find more information on the videos otherwise. That one talked about intermittent fasting as a treatment for type 2 diabetes and for remission. And of course, that's one of the things that is really effective, because if you don't eat, then of course your body will burn off some of the sugar. So that's really good. So yeah, the second thing I wanted to talk about was those Medium articles. So again, if you want to read them, then do go on to the links that I posted on the community chat in the main channel. Those are friend links, which means that you can bypass the paywall and access the articles, because I'm not trying to hide them. It just happens that blog site that I use wound up paywalling the whole thing. And what it discussed was really the low insulin diet. And this is one of the things that I talked about in the obesity code, which is that insulin is a key driver of weight gain, because insulin is a nutrient sensor, and its job is really to tell your body to store energy in the form of body fat. So that's its job, right? So if you have too much insulin, of course, then you're going to store more body fat, because you're telling your body to store more body fat. And it's not really about the calories, because if you take, say, a meal and you take 1,000 calories, and one is sort of pure carbohydrates and the other is like proteins and fats, Well, the pure carbohydrates are going to stimulate a lot of insulin. So a lot of those calories are going to be siphoned off immediately into body fat because of that high insulin. Whereas if you're eating a lot of the proteins and fats, then what's going to happen is that less of it, because there's less insulin, is going to go into storage, which leaves a lot of it available for you to use, which means that your body has a source of energy. It's going to stay full. So, for example, to put it into practical terms, suppose you eat a breakfast of 2 slices of white bread with jam, so almost pure carbohydrate, and orange juice, for example. What happens is that you take those 500 calories, and because of the high insulin, a lot of it, say 400 calories, immediately goes into storage, which leaves you with very little energy to actually use. So by 10:30, you're going to be like hungry and looking for something to eat. So you go get a low-fat muffin, and the whole cycle starts again. But if you eat, say, a vegetable omelet, and they've done these studies many times, you take a vegetable omelet and you give people the vegetable omelet, there's less insulin, so less of it goes into storage. So instead of 500 calories, 400 going to fat, maybe 100 goes into fat. So there's 400 calories just floating around, which means that you stay full because you have plenty of energy to use, right? So there's a huge difference. Same number of calories, but the hormones makes all the difference. So one way is to lower the total number of carbohydrates, and that's what we covered in the obesity code, those years ago. But that's actually not the only factor. There's actually a whole lot of other factors that goes into insulin, and even if you have carbohydrates, there are ways to lower the insulin effect of those carbohydrates. And because most people think that you eat and it goes into your bloodstream, that's not the way that the body works. There's actually a whole number of intervening steps. So when you eat, you have to digest it first, which means you have to take the food, you have to chew it, then it goes into the stomach churns it mixes it with acid, and then holds it. And then it slowly gives out a little bit into the intestines, a little bit at a time, because you're eating food at a faster rate than your body can actually absorb those nutrients. So it needs a holding cell, sort of. So it holds the food and slowly releases it. So the thing is that if you have a food such as flour, which is very easily digested because it's all ground up in a very fine powder, it's highly refined. Well, it's easy to digest as opposed to, say, a whole grain or rice with bran, or steel cut oats, for example. It's contained within a plant cell wall, and therefore it's a lot easier to digest. You got to chew it more, you got to cook it more, you got to do all these things. So highly refined foods are sort of pre-digested. They're easy to chew, they're easy to swallow, they're easy to digest, and then the stomach just shoots them out really fast because it doesn't hold them. Other foods which are slower to digest, well, that's going to make a difference because the slower you digest it, the slower the glucose in the blood goes up. So therefore, there's a lot of things such as vinegar, for example, can really alter that, the rate of rise. We can measure it using something called the glycemic index, which is how quickly your blood glucose rises in response to food. So certain foods have a very, very high glycemic index, such as white bread is probably the worst one. But a lot of the natural carbohydrates like sweet potato and stuff have a much lower one. And that makes a difference because in the end, it's not the total carbohydrates that's important. It's the effect on the insulin. And you can affect it by changing those things. So in that Medium article, I went through a number of them. In fact, there's actually quite a number of factors that we don't always think about that can affect that. So eating carbohydrates by themselves, for example, is something that's not really recommended because, again, what happens is that when your body digests it and shoots it into the intestine, all you get is carbohydrates. So the rate of rise of glucose is very, very fast. As opposed to if you eat bread, mixed with a meal, say like if you have a hamburger, you've got some meat, but you've also got some carbohydrates. Well, when it gets all mixed into the stomach, and then the stomach puts a little bit into the intestines, it's not like 100% glucose that's sitting there. And because there's other things there, the rate of rise of glucose is much, much smaller than it is. So in part two, I sort of finish it off, but there was like 15 different factors that can affect the insulin levels, other than, number one, of course, eat fewer carbohydrates, but eating natural carbohydrates makes a difference. Eating things that are very coarsely ground, like a larger particle size versus very finely ground carbohydrates, that makes a difference, because again, if it's very coarsely ground, it's harder to release those nutrients because the food has contained it. There's difference between amylose and amylopectin. So these are the two types of starches in the human diet. Most is amylopectin, but certain ones are higher in amylose, and amylose is actually more difficult to digest than the amylopectin. And if you look at varieties of rice, for example, certain varieties are much higher in amylose than others. So sticky rice, short grain rice, tends to be relatively low in amylose. Therefore, you get a much higher rise in glycemic index, as opposed to the fluffier rices, which are things like jasmine or basmati rice, which tend to be much lower in glycemic index. And the lowest actually is converted rice, which is parboiled rice. And that's actually because they cook it partially in the husk, and therefore it's a lot more difficult to digest, which slows down that rate of rise. Another thing is a resistant starch. So you can actually turn some of the starches into starches that are not easily digested. So if you cook rice and then you cool it and then you cook it again, the cooking solubilizes or gelatinizes the starch. So it becomes more liquid-like. When you cool it, it crystallizes, and the crystalline structure of that rice is more difficult to digest. That's why when you put rice in the fridge, you actually can't eat it cold because it's terrible. It's very brittle and so on. As you reheat it, some of it stays in that crystalline structure, so you get resistant starch. And by doing that, you actually slow down the glycemic index around 20-30%, so fairly significant. Potatoes, you can't cook and then cool and then reheat, because all that crystalline structure gets solubilized. So if you eat cold potatoes, like a potato salad, that does. Interestingly, and people have pointed this out before, if you look at pasta compared to white bread, there's a huge difference in the glycemic index. So pasta has a much lower glycemic index than white bread, and that's because, again, of this concept called the food matrix, which is the structure in which you have the food, which makes it easier or harder to digest. So in pasta, what happens is that you can get you have the carbohydrate, and both pasta and bread are made of flour. But with pasta, you have it mixed in with the main protein, which is gluten or gliadin. And then that makes it more difficult to digest. So it's about 25% lower with that. So really, there are a lot of these things that can contribute to the insulin effect, as opposed to just the pure number of carbohydrates. And some of these things include eating late. So eating carbohydrates heavy meal late in the day also makes a big difference, because if you give somebody a meal and you give it to them sort of early in the day versus late in the day, there's actually a big difference. There's about a 20-30% difference in the insulin effect of that meal. So if you, and it's the exact same meal, it's just that your body reacts differently to it. Therefore, when you're eating very late in the day, if you're producing more insulin, more of those calories are getting shuttled into the storage form, which is the fat. And that sort of makes sense, because your body sort of knows that, hey, if you're eating late, you really don't have much time to use it. So therefore, you need to store more of it, because you're just going to go to sleep like very, very soon. So that's important, because if you eat earlier in the day, then you're going to have a better effect. One, you're going to be less hungry, because people tend to be hungrier at night. Two, for what you do eat, you're going to produce less insulin. And three, if you eat a big breakfast, especially a lower carbohydrate one, it's going to keep you full for longer. So even if you eat a really big breakfast, you can compensate by sort of having a smaller lunch or dinner. Whereas if you're eating a really big dinner, then you can't compensate anymore. You're going to sleep and that's it. So those are all these sort of tricks of the trade sort of thing to go along with it. And then fasting, of course, is something that can always be done to lower insulin. It's a sort of the most efficient way of doing it. I saw a question here about, hacks for like a longer fast. And, I did want to address that as well. And, a lot of the data shows now that even if you do a longer fast, if you're doing a 3-day, 4-day, 5-day fast, even if you take a little bit of food, you're still going to get the majority of the benefits. And, this is from recent data. So keep in mind that when I wrote the obesity code and the complete guide to fasting, it's fasting was really considered like crazy. Like nobody wanted to do it. It was like insane. So there wasn't a lot of data. Nobody was studying it. But lately, there's been these fasting variations to study, and there was two main ones. So one was the 5-2 diet that was popularized by Dr. Michael Mosley, and there's actually a lot of data behind that. And his idea was that for 5 days you eat normally, and for 2 days you do a fast, but not a full complete fast. You still take 500 calories. So it's not a full fast. And then the other one was a fasting mimicking diet, where they actually provide you, it's a 5-day fast once a month, but they provide you with the food, and it's about 500 to 800 calories. So again, it's essentially fasting, but there is a little bit of food. And what's important is that when you compare what these diets do, which is not a classic water only fast, you actually get most of the benefits. So even if you have a little bit, just to take the edge off the hunger, for example, it's still, you're still going to preserve a lot of the benefits. It doesn't mean you just eat whatever. Like you still want to stay fairly low carbohydrate, sort of whole food based, because you still want to minimize that insulin, which is the whole point of the fasting. But you can still maintain a lot of the benefits of that. So yeah, keep that in mind, that you don't have to be perfect. Like that's not the goal. If it's very difficult and you need to take a little something, yes, there are things. So there are things that you can take, whether it's 500 calories, the 5-2 diet didn't specify, or they have these fast bars, which the fasting mimicking diet does. You can still get a lot of those benefits from that. So that was really great. And then the other thing I want to discuss and is the paper. So I posted a link to the paper that my friend Dr. Jen Unwin published. And what was really important, and she looked at the title of it was Low Carbohydrate and Psychoeducational Programs Show Promise for the Treatment of Ultra-Processed Food Addiction, and a 12-month follow-up. And this is probably one of the most, I would think, is the most important topics of the recent sort of 5 to 10 years, I'd have to say, is the data on ultra-processed food. So it was just getting going when I wrote the obesity code. I was writing it around 2014, but even then I had said, well, the major difference in Western diets compared to traditional diets is not carbohydrates or calories or anything like that. It's actually the level of processing. And really, since then, the evidence has only gotten higher and higher. And the way to understand it is that processed foods are, in a way, sort of pre-digested, in that they take a food and they make it incredibly easy to eat and very rewarding to eat in a way that's unnatural. So you don't see it in nature. So even though food is enjoyable and stuff, they take that and they sort of amplify the good parts and try to minimize the other parts. So instead of having something sweet like an orange or something, they take flour, and then they add chocolate and sugar and butter, and really make it into this whole process thing, and then chemicals and artificial coloring, and then so on. And ultra processed foods really does everything opposite to what natural foods do. Where natural foods have natural satiety mechanisms, a lot of these processed foods sort of circumvent it. And of course, the reason they do that is that they want to sell more. So if you eat a certain food, broccoli, for example, you can only eat so much before your stomach fills up, before you activate all these satiety hormones, and you have to stop. Like if you go to a buffet, you can't just keep eating. At some point, you have to stop because you can't take it anymore. Well, that's not good if you're trying to sell food. So what ultra processed foods has done is they've sort of optimized getting you to eat more food, because then they sell more food and then they make more money. So they're actually engineered to be, very, very, like, they stimulate a lot of these sort of reward signals in the brain, pleasure signals in the brain, and they have very low satiety. So when you eat them, you don't feel full at all. There's something called a concept called sensory specific satiety, which means that when you eat the same thing over and over, you just don't really want to eat it so much anymore. And then, so what they do? Well, they give it to you in many flavors. There's another concept called vanishing caloric density. And what that means is that if it's very light on the tongue, then your brain almost doesn't feel like it's eaten anything, and you can eat more. So you think of a cheese puff or a potato chip. It's so light that your body almost doesn't even sense it. It goes down and it's through you, and you've taken those calories without even getting any satiety from it, without even noticing it. So again, because you can do that, you can eat more and more, and they can sell more and more. So really, one of the really important things, and one of the things that ultra processed foods has done, because they've sort of engineered these foods, because they're not natural foods, they've engineered these foods to be very rewarding. Sometimes it tips over into food addiction. So people say, well, you can't really be addicted to foods. It's like, well, actually, you can. People say it all the time, so I'm a chocoholic, or, I'm addicted to, starchy foods. They have these foods called comfort foods, which again are foods that make you feel better. So again, you're not eating them because you're hungry. You're eating them because of the rewarding sensation that you're getting from these foods. And that tips over into food addiction. And what Dr. Jen Unwin did in this paper, which was very important, and I've put the link to it, was that she sort of followed this Yale food addiction scale. So this was introduced about 12, 15 years ago, so that they could measure food addiction. Is actually surprisingly common, probably about 12, 15%. But if you look at people trying to lose weight, it's actually much, much higher than that. And they combine that with a web-based educational program where they basically cut down a lot of the ultra-processed foods, tried to go into a lower carbohydrate meal, cut out the, and then combine that with sort of online sessions. And what they're able to show is a remission at 12 months of 62% of these people. Like, that's huge, because if you think about people who are trying to lose a significant amount of weight, there's a lot of them who are actually not just, low willpower. I don't think that's actually true, but a lot of them could certainly be addicted to food. And if you have a food addiction, then you have to treat that addiction. You can't just simply say, oh, just eat less, right? For other areas in medicine, of course, if you're addicted to alcohol, nobody says, well, just drink less. Or if you're addicted to heroin, oh, just shoot up less. Like, that's not good advice, right? So if you're addicted to foods, well, then you don't need to treat it as an addiction. You can't simply say, oh, just eat less, because that's not helpful. You have to, one, acknowledge that it's true. And a lot of people really haven't gotten to that stage yet. It's still sort of this evolving field. And, you have to really acknowledge that what is it that's driving it? And again, it's probably the ultra processed foods. So if you think about what people say, oh, I'm addicted to, X, it's never like a natural food, right? I'm addicted to salmon or addicted to, papaya. I like it, but it's not like you feel a compulsion to eat it the same way that some people do with sweets and candies and so on. So again, really important topic, and this was one of the first papers that really looked at treatment of food addictions, and also the link to ultra processed foods. And again, something that I think is really, really very important to recognize, because again, it's not necessarily about cutting out all foods or even all carbohydrates, but maybe the real problem lies in those ultra processed carbohydrates. And then if that's the case, then just focus on that. Like, you may not have to cut out some of the more natural carbohydrates, for those that don't want to. Of course, cutting out all carbohydrates is possible, but maybe that's a little bit more severe than it needs to be for you to still stay healthy. So yeah, that's really exciting stuff. So I encourage you to have a look at the videos, have a look at the blogs. That's a great paper, and I'm writing some of these in medium.com. So keep your eye out for that. I'm in the process of writing a follow-up to the obesity code as well, which is going to cover some of these sort of exciting topics in nutrition science, which really, again, points us away from this whole calorie thing, because the calorie thing has been such a dead end for so long. Like, everybody's been like, oh, calories, calories, calories. Well, what if you have food addiction? What if the problem is ultra processed foods, right? Is eating 2,000 calories of natural foods the same as 2,000 calories of ultra processed foods? And it's not. They're completely different. Like, the hormonal response is completely different. So our body's going to react completely different. If you're eating really late at night versus, earlier, that's going to make a difference too. So you got to understand how these things all contribute. So thanks so much for everybody for your support here. So I'm just gonna see if I can answer a few questions here. There's something about constipation during fasting, and that is something you have to deal with, because if there's less going in, there's less coming out. So really, the only problem is if you become uncomfortable. So constipation is a problem if there's a lot in there that's not coming out. Then, of course, you can take there's lots of different types of laxatives out there. But when you're fasting, especially the longer fast, the number of bowel movements will slow down, because there's simply less food going in. So there's going to be less stool coming out. You just have to accept it and understand it. If it is a problem, then you can always use these dual bulking agents, which is mostly psyllium husk. So Metamucil was the classic, but basically it's a whole lot of fiber, and the fiber is not absorbed. So it just kind of goes down into your bowels, and it absorbs water, and it forms a big bulk. And that's how it acts as a laxative. So, it is very common. So just be aware of that. You don't necessarily have to do anything about it, but it's always good to make sure. Another one here is like, would like to start a long fast, and what hacks would I use? And that was what I was saying about trying to, not be perfect on the fasting day. What I often do is I often take a little bit of vegetables once a day for the ones that are longer than about 2 days or so. Because I find it easier. It makes it a lot easier. So if you're getting like 80% of the benefit, but it's, only 50% is hard, well, that's a good trade-off, and allows me to do it much longer. So that's really good. Question about acid reflux during fasting. And again, that can happen because especially if people are overweight, that increases the pressure, the intra-abdominal pressure, which means that some of it can reflux up when you're not having food. And so that when you're fasting, one, you can try to take something during the fast. You can also take things like, things that are sort of bulky, but without calories. So the two things that are very useful would be the psyllium husk, which is used for a stool softener. So again, that's going to go into the stomach, and that's going to help bulk things up, so it's not as easy to reflux back up. So psyllium husk or other bulking agents. And then the other one is chia seeds, which are also very good because you just mix them with the water, it increases the viscosity, and it forms this sort of mucousy stuff that goes when you eat it, it goes into the stomach, and the same thing, it just sort of absorbs all. One thing that is actually quite interesting, which I hadn't known previously, but there's a whole people always think that when you have stomach pains that you have too much stomach acid. And the interesting thing is that your stomach is supposed to have acid. If it refluxes up, it sometimes doesn't do that, but sometimes this solution is actually to increase the acidity. So I've had a few people who have actually taken something to increase the acidity. And there's some supplements, it escapes me at the moment what it is, but to increase the stomach acidity. And the point being that when you increase the acidity, and you can use it with things like lemon juice, for example, but when you increase the acidity, what happens is that you increase peristalsis, which means that you're going to increase the forward movement of the stomach. So therefore, the stomach content, including the acid, is going to go forward into the intestines rather than being available to reflux back up into the esophagus. So while everybody assumes that it's always too much acidity, sometimes it's actually too little acidity. And I don't think that problem has always been addressed adequately. So it's keep that in mind. Maybe a light organic acid. So the organic acids is vinegars and is acetic acid, and lemon juice, lime juice is citric acid. So those things are available, and you can try them. And I actually just can't remember the name of that supplement that my friend had used for that, but it wound up helping. He spent like years taking antacids, but then finally realized that he actually had the opposite problem, which is that he actually had too little acidity and all that. So give that a go. And let me see if I can answer one more question. It says vital wheat gluten is a flour, but is very high in protein. What are your thoughts on that? Gluten is the main protein in wheat, and there are certain ways to take the gluten out, which is how they get those flours that have low gluten. But some people actually eat the gluten. You actually see it in Chinese cuisine a lot as well. So if you're eating the gluten, so you can go to the Chinese grocery store and buy just gluten. It's just wheat gluten. What you're eating is protein. So it's no different than any other protein. It's actually quite good for you because you're not eating a lot of the carbohydrate. You're actually eating the separated protein from that wheat, which is quite interesting. It tastes actually pretty good, although I don't eat it very often. But again, because it's mostly protein, you're not getting much carbohydrate, which means you're not getting much of the glucose effect or the insulin effect. So that's good. So yeah, that's great. And another question here about vegetarian protein. And again, vegetarian protein is always a little more difficult because there aren't a lot of super high sources. I mean, tofu is one, lentils, beans, that kind of thing, but they tend to be lower in protein than meat, for example. So therefore, you have to look. So eggs are also a source, but that's always a continual question. When you look at studies of vegetarian, in fact, the amount of protein that they eat tends to be much, much, much lower than a person who eats sort of all foods, including meat, because meat is actually so high in protein because there's no carbs at all. It's really just proteins and fats. So the whole thing is definitely something to consider. I mean, I have nothing against vegetarianism or anything like that, but you do have to keep in mind that it is going to be lower in protein naturally, even if you look for higher protein sources. if you add protein, so that's the other thing that some people try to do, which is protein bars and protein powders, it's may or may not be the same. So when they did studies of sprinkling powder, various soy powders and all this stuff, protein powders onto food, what they actually found was that you could increase satiety. That is, people felt more full because of the protein that they sprinkled on, but they didn't eat any less. So it didn't affect their eating behavior much at all. So whether it actually has the same effect as eating a high protein diet is a little bit of a question. So, I'm not entirely sure that the answer lies in sort of these ultra processed protein powders, because the main thing is really eating a balanced natural diet, which is so staying away from those processed foods, whether it's processed carbohydrates or processed proteins like whey protein or whatever, or processed fats. I mean, processed fats being seed oils. And again, that's a controversial topic. A lot of people sort of on both sides. Some people who think it's really good for you, and other people who think it's really bad for you. So those are really important questions. They're very topical. I tend to think that it's probably best just to avoid processed stuff in general. Because if you don't know that it's really safe for you or good for you, then why take it, right? That was the whole idea with margarine, for example. People said, don't eat butter, it's going to kill you, right? Despite the fact that people had been eating butter for thousands and thousands of years and weren't having a problem. Why would it be a problem in 1980? And yet, for 2000 years prior, there's no problem. So the idea is that you should really just stick to what's natural, because there's a much lower likelihood that's going to cause you problems. So seed oils, vegetable oils, canola oil, and so on is a relatively sort of new food, and we're really not sure if it's going to be good for you or bad for you. So margarine, of course, was super popular in the late 70s and 80s. There was all these things about, I can't believe it's not butter, and the cell, which was going to, save your heart and stuff. And it turns out they actually wound up being full of trans fats. So they were actually causing heart disease, but in fact, they were being sold as being able to prevent heart disease. And they only found out 15, 20 years later, right? Same thing with avocados and olive oil and fatty fish, which were all these sort of healthy, natural fats. People stopped eating them for decades, through the late 70s, the 80s, and early 90s. People weren't eating any fat. They thought it was terrible, right? Then it turns out, because of the Mediterranean diet, these people who are eating all these nuts and all these avocados and olive oil, they're way healthier than the people not. So then, everybody went backwards and said, oh, no, you have to have enough of these healthy fats. But people forget, for 20 years, they're completely banned. But again, if you simply follow a very simple sort of rule, just eat what people have been always eating, well, you're less likely to get into trouble. So staying away from ultra processed foods, including ultra processed fats and ultra processed proteins, all of those is probably going to lead you in better health for sure. And if you don't know what to eat, of course, you can always fast, because that's, again, another way of sort of clearing out the body. So thanks so much for everybody. So again, just to recap, have a look at the videos. There's the blogs. I linked to the paper by Dr. Jen Unwin, which I think is a terrific paper. And also, we do have a clinic now in Toronto for type 2 diabetes remission at the Boniface Park Clinic, if anybody wants to look that up. All right. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.